Hey there, World History. This is your World War I Technology and Battles lecture. This dog has nothing to do with this lecture. I just really like this picture, so here it is. I am going to keep my discussion to many of the basics, and as we review this together in person, I will try to fill in some of the extra stories and details to make it a little bit more interesting. But so this video doesn't get too long, again, I'm going to stick mostly to the facts, the basic facts and the things that are on the slides. So make sure to note any areas of interest or questions that you have so I can fill those in once we are discussing this together. Okay, World War I was considered a total war, and this means a nation would use their full military technology and human resources to win, use everything they have to win a battle. In the case of World War I, that often meant women and children were being forced to go to the workplace, often factories, because all the men had been shipped off to the front lines. Families needed to ration their food, so that meant they were only allowed small amounts of foods like sugar, meat, flour, and so on to make sure that there would be enough for the soldiers on the front lines. And propaganda was frequently sent around to make sure that there was support for their side, for their soldiers, for things like rationing, and also to make sure that people believed that the enemy truly was evil and needed to be defeated. Total war also means that there were no limits to the weapons that were used, the territories that were attacked, or who was considered a combatant, which means civilians and soldiers were often considered fair targets. Some of the new technology or new uses of old technology included the use of shovels as not only to dig trenches, but then perhaps to fight or to use as shields, machine guns, poison gas, flamethrowers, and some of these were extra dangerous because not only were they used against the soldiers, but they would often spread to the areas around them, causing civilian casualties as well. There were advancements in transportation, like the use of tanks to get through dangerous areas between the trenches, somewhat effectively and somewhat not effectively because this was still a pretty new type of transportation. And same goes for airplanes. At this point, airplanes were mostly used for observation of trenches from above. Later on in the war, they do start to get used and they start to fly with guns and grenades, so they get used a little bit more in combat, but that becomes a bigger deal in World War II. And then U-boats. These are German submarines, and we will end up talking about them a lot more in our next lecture on World War I. But essentially, these German submarines were most useful to blockade the enemy ports. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Like they blocked access. They blocked ships' abilities to get to their destination to bring supplies and fresh soldiers to and from where they were needed. So I don't think we need to go into all the ins and outs of trench warfare because I know a lot of us know a great deal about that, but I want to note a couple important things. Here is a rough drawing of what a trench system might have looked like, and I want you to pay a little bit of attention to this no man's land. This no man's land was often about the length of a football field between the two sets of enemy trenches. It was often filled with barbed wire, metal obstacles, sometimes landmines, but it was also just open space. So as soldiers wanted to come up and over out of their trenches and rush to attack the other trenches, they were often sitting ducks because they were rushing across in these open fields. The other thing that would happen as they would attack over no man's land is that even if they made some sort of gain within a couple days or weeks later, the other side would rush them and then they would be back where they started. Because each time, each side was only gaining small amounts of land. This resulted in the loss of many, many soldiers, not to mention the living conditions themselves. If you can imagine living in trenches for days and weeks and months on end, so that they were very dirty. And the soldiers would often contract diseases, which also led to a large amount of deaths of the soldiers. Ultimately, this comes to a stalemate where neither side could win. So let's take a look at a few more, or a few specific battles that were really affected by trench warfare. The First Battle of the Marne was really where both sides dug down deep, no pun intended, they literally did. This was the first real battle where armies were digging trenches, and over the course of the war, over the course of a long time, the armies ended up digging 200 miles worth of trench systems, and this became the front for the rest of the war on the western side. In the First Battle of the Marne specifically, Germany was actually close to a breakthrough. And this is a little bit of just kind of a really interesting story, is not so much a vital fact, but the French, in order to reinforce their troops, they used 600 taxis to get 6,000 men to the battle lines. But really what this battle taught everyone was that this war was not going to be easy or short or great. Two other key battles on the Western Front that demonstrate the stalemates of the trench-style warfare were the Battle of Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. In the Battle of Verdun, the Germans had made some progress against the Russians. And so they were able to send some troops back to the Western Front, and they decided to conduct an offensive and basically attempt to break the stalemate by wearing down the French and killing as many of them as possible until they wanted to give up. And while they fought and fought and fought, they fought with 140,000 people and 1,200 pieces of artillery. So this is just the Germans. The French refused to give up. And by the end, a couple months later, over 300,000 soldiers, so collectively both sides, had died. And in the end, there was no advantage gained by either side. Meanwhile, the British, the French allies, decide a similar approach would be useful. And so they attempt to break a stalemate at the Battle of the Somme. Now, England is just over the English Channel up north here. And so their thought is not only to break down the German trenches, but to force the Germans to come give attention here and divert them from this constant battle against the British-French allies. And they too, the British were very effective and sent over something like 1 million explosive shells into the German trenches. The Germans actually saw them preparing through their own airplane reconnaissance missions. So they kind of were prepared for this onslaught. And they had dug really strong concrete reinforced trenches. And this battle too went on for months, and there was a lot of damage done on both sides. But again, roughly 300,000 men collectively died. So all told, between these two battles, nearly 1 million casualties occurred for virtually nothing. Virtually nothing. Maybe a couple miles of advancement for one side or the other. But what the main result was that the public back home was over it. They were no longer in support of this war, as the newspapers continued to publish the name of those who died, were wounded, were captured, or were missing in action. Meanwhile, we have a whole other front that we haven't even addressed yet, and that's the Eastern Front. The Russians surprised the Germans by being ready sooner than expected. And while it appeared that they were well equipped, well led, and well trained, they were really none of those things. But they did have a huge advantage in numbers. They were not splitting their troops like the Germans were. And so they had just a massive army ready to fight. But what really got in Russia's way was that the Ottoman Empire, remember, they start out as allies of, as part of the Central Powers, as basically Team Germany and Austria-Hungary. And what they do, and I'm going to jump to a map, and I'm going to go back and forth because I realize that might have gone kind of quick. But so far, all the battles we've talked about were here in the Western Front. But now we need to shift our attention to the Eastern Front, just like the Germans did. And let's remember this idea of a blockade. And what the Turks were able to do is they were able to blockade this waterway here that prevented the Russians from getting supplies from their allies, France and Great Britain. So France and Great Britain were trying to send supplies through the Mediterranean, through what's called the Strait of the Dardanelles, into the Black Sea to get to Russia. but the Turks were able to block them at this city called Gallipoli. We'll talk about that more in just a second, but let's go back to this slide so you can fill it in. The Turks blocked that major Russian supply port, and so this is really what ends up making Russia fall apart. But before I get to that, we should note that there were a couple mild Russian successes. They were able to push back the Austrian-Hungary forces, and they were able to keep the German forces split, which means that the Germans couldn't just dominate France and take over on the Western Front. The Battle of Gallipoli is the Allies' biggest attempt to help out Russia. The British, mostly the British, but there were some Canadian forces, French forces, and Anzac forces, which were the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, they coordinated an effort to invade Gallipoli, which is this area right at the front of the Straits of the Dardanelles. And the idea is to divert the Turkish army and then eventually eliminate them from the war altogether, and then of course get supplies to their ally, Russia. But what happens is the Allies basically invade with a poor plan. They underestimated the Turkish forces, and they do not appreciate the difficulty of the terrain in this part of the world. And so the Allies suffer mass casualties. This is considered one of the worst amphibious disasters in Allied World War I history. So amphibious meaning going from water to land. And they lose 145,000 men. Eventually they are indeed defeated by the Turks because the Turks were able to sink many of the British naval ships. So perhaps you're able to guess that this is the point where Russia has to drop out. The amount of problems is piling up. This blockade and this inability to get supplies results in food and fuel shortages. The soldiers become very weak and fail, and then 10 Russians were killed for every German soldier that was killed. So they were experiencing mass casualties. And then I'm sure it's no surprise that there was little to no public support anymore for Russian involvement in this war. And this goes so far that the Russian people actually revolt and oust their Tsar and kill both him and his entire family, and a new government takes over in this Russian Revolution. This is easily worth its own month or more of study. It's a fascinating revolution. But to stay focused on what we're discussing here, in late 1917, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed between Russia and the Germans, and Russia officially withdraws from World War I. And this results in our last slide, and the war shifting fronts. At this point, since Russia is gone, Germany can focus their full efforts on the Western Front. So everyone can focus on, all Central Power forces can focus on France. And this rejuvenates the Central Powers, and they make big advances at first. And meanwhile, they are able to use their U-boats to blockade many of the British and French ports, so both the British and the French start to suffer from a lack of supplies and an inability to get their soldiers to and from where they need to go. Eventually, and where we're going to pick up next time, is that the United States finally joins the war. And when they join the war, they join up on the Allied side, and they join the French and British armies. This does allow the Allied forces to push the Germans back, because the reinforcements of people and supplies from the United States help both practically, like logically, giving the Allied forces what they need, and emotionally that they have this new group of men as soldiers to help them out. So I feel like I talked really fast to keep this short. I don't know if that's a good thing for you. That's kind of rapid fire, and there's a lot more we could talk about in class. So please make sure to note if you have any questions or areas of extra interest, and we will talk about them when we are together again.